Obviously a very provocative title, Why Women Shouldn't Rule the World, and especially given the amazing talk that you've just heard. Actually, I do think that women should be more involved with decisions that are happening in the world. My point is more that I believe that everything in living in nature requires balance, and I think that we've been living in a world of imbalance for a very long time. We've been living in a world that has a history of leadership, decision and policy making that has been mostly made by men using their masculine energy. And energy is an important word to me because I'm not here today to talk to you about gender equality. I'm here to talk to you and to tell you about and share with you an ongoing conversation and passion I have for creating cultures and communities where we can empower men and women to tap into both their masculine and feminine energy and bring their whole selves to everything that they do. I'd like to share with you a journey that started for me here 7 years ago in Delhi, which is quite synchronistic, actually, where I was lucky enough to be nominated and selected for the 10th Duke of Edinburgh Commonwealth Study Tour, working together for inclusive development and growth. The first Commonwealth Study Tour was set out to be, in the words of its founder, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, an extraordinary experiment. The purpose was to bring together future leaders from the Commonwealth countries and give them an opportunity to challenge their assumptions and prejudices, to go out and explore the relationship between industry and the communities that are in it, and to come back and share their conclusions. And for me, it was an extraordinary experiment. We had just under 200 leaders from around the world, from 30 different countries, from extremely diverse backgrounds, working together in groups of 12 to 15 to answer specific issues for the host countries of India and Malaysia. And then we had to present back in a conference full of the media, heads of business, heads of government, and Princess Anne and Prince Philip. Now, the group that I was in were tasked with staying in Delhi, and we were asked to answer the question that did we think that the GDP growth of India was inclusive and sustainable? Now, this was extraordinary in itself for me, but what I found most fascinating was the absolute diversity of the group that I was working in. We were from completely different backgrounds, completely different cultures. We didn't know each other for a start, and so we were all wondering, how are we going to work together? Who's the most senior? Who's the most experienced? Who's going to lead us? And then for me, something pivotal and remarkable happened. I offered, with some trepidation, to provide some structure to our first meeting, and with obvious relief, everybody accepted and agreed. Now, I definitely wasn't the most senior or the most experienced person there. And also, I was a woman working in a predominantly male industry, and yet here I was in India, stepping into a leadership vacuum to provide structure, and it had impact. They definitely wanted me to help. So that was the first of 3 startling realizations I had while I was there in India. The second one also happened during our first meeting, and this was when our host from the Confederation of Indian Industries provided us with a schedule of meetings for our tour. There were people that were going to be meeting over the 2 weeks, and I can remember my growing sense of unease as I looked through the schedule, and I looked at my colleagues, and they were all nodding. And finally, I felt the courage to speak up. And I wanted to know from my colleagues, did they think that the people that we were meeting over the 2 weeks were a fair representation of people from India to answer our question? And I can remember my heart hammering in my chest, just like now, as I asked that question, and then the surge of excitement I felt afterwards when I noticed that they were realizing what I was actually saying. And we began to work together to collectively and collaboratively question the tool that had been created for us. Why weren't we visiting the slums, the charities, the social enterprises, and the entrepreneurs? The people who are constantly fighting in a system where the poverty gap is getting larger. The people who don't have the benefit of the infrastructure and where resources are becoming more exclusive. Why weren't we visiting women and children, the future leaders of the country, who should and would have a say in how it is being managed and developed? And they'd have really creative ideas about how to do that too. I also remember the look on the face of our host as he watched us tear up our schedules and he realized that he had a rebellion on his hands. Now, I'm certain that 90% of the hosts who were part of that study tour would at that point deferred us to their managers and said, I don't know what to do about this. But as Vivek looked around at our determined faces, he rolled up his sleeves and he got stuck into helping us to create a whole new kind of study tour. And in that moment, Vivek became not only our host, but also our colleague and our co-conspirator in the most positive of ways. He chose not to listen to the words, the historical and cultural leadership words in his head that said, this is not possible. And instead he said, why not? Which I thought was amazing. Again, this was about balance for me, not pure rebellion. We also needed to go and visit the CEOs and the policymakers. But what I really wanted to know is if what they would say would be aligned with the community on their doorsteps. And for the most part, it wasn't. So I could talk all day about the wonderful experience that was the study tour, the tears, the colourful conversations, and the cultural confusions, of which there were many. I don't have time to do that today, so instead I would like to share with you my third and most powerful realisation. One that has shaped my life and career and has brought me to be on this stage here before you today. After a week on the tour, a small group of us decided to embark on another small rebellion to satisfy our curiosity about dining out in Delhi. So again, in a synchronistic moment, we took a taxi to Connaught Place, where we found a beautiful rooftop restaurant. It was Italian, it was lovely, just what we needed. We sat and had an amazing meal. And when we'd finished and we were paying, something happened that will stay with me for the rest of my life. From the street below, we heard a crash and a squeal of brakes and human cries, and when we looked over the rooftop, we saw a man lying in the street, surrounded by pieces of a broken cart. Now, there were people stood around him, but from what I could see, nobody was doing anything to help, so I quickly rushed down. The man lying in the street was an Indian of low caste. He was an untouchable, I think. His head was bleeding, and as I sat on the floor and I held his hand in mine, although we couldn't speak with any language, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the fear in his eyes wasn't because he was probably going to die. It was because he was leaving behind a family that had nothing and nobody to provide for them. The Indian people that were stood around us were higher caste, and in our ignorance, we shouted at them to get help. Why weren't they doing anything to get an ambulance? We were so shocked by the lack of compassion that we were seeing, the lack of empathy. Here was a human being potentially dying in my hands, and his fellow countrymen and women weren't doing anything to help. We just couldn't understand what could be the cause of this. And then eventually, one of the people stood around us decided to challenge our ignorance and said that the unwritten rule in Delhi at the time was that if you took somebody to specific hospitals, you ran the risk of being liable for their medical bills. So this made me stop and think. In a country where accidents and injuries and death are constant and life can seem cheap, you would either have to develop indifference or risk the potential for poverty yourself by trying to help everybody that you meet. So for me, the issue wasn't the people stood around that day who weren't helping. The issue is a system that creates a society where people don't feel that they can help. And this is my point. I'd like to hazard a guess that the individuals who made that rule were making it from a masculine energy. They were quite rightly thinking about the practicalities of underfunded hospitals overrun by injured and sick people who can't afford to pay for their medical bills. Possibly they were thinking about the growing population in the city and slums that don't have the infrastructure to support them. They were maybe even thinking from a survival of the fittest or the richest mentality. Now I'd like to return to my original provocative statement about why I don't think women should rule the world. And I think about this rule being made by individuals, not men or women, but individuals using purely feminine energy. And the fact is that if we tried to help everybody that was out there that needed it without the infrastructure to support us, then it's virtually impossible for society to continue. This is why balance is important. So I believe that by using a balance of energies, we can potentially create a new global system where we can freely experience our human empathy. We can react to our natural instincts to help, knowing that we have the resources and the infrastructure to support this. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you what happened to the man in that street that day. Eventually, an ambulance did turn up, and we watched as the ambulance men got out and literally picked him up by his hands and feet once they realised who he was and threw him into the back of the ambulance. But in that moment, myself and my colleagues, we felt triumphant. We felt that we'd done something. Standing here before you today, I know that the only triumph of that day was the butterfly effect of change that it started with the media interest that had galvanized, and also that it unlocked in me a deep desire to make change happen in the world and to create balance, which leads me to share with you why I think that the study tour was so life-changing and magical for us. We empowered each other and ourselves to lead an experience that was driven by our desire for balance. Balance in our ability to tap into our leadership decision-making in terms of masculine and feminine, and also balance in our ability to tap into the ideas and the experience of both the culture that we were in India and the collective cultures that we brought with us. And that enabled us to authentically and fearlessly provide recommendations that, if followed, we felt could make sustainable change happen. Collectively, we have the knowledge to create global societies and communities that are empowering for everybody. We have the information, the material and the resources to make new kinds of decisions based on our historical experiences that will enable us to change the world for the better. Now, I'm lucky enough to be part of a movement of global leaders and influencers who are working collectively towards this goal. I may be idealistic in my approach, but I believe I would like us to create corporations that are compassionate and creative as well as commercial, by developing symbiotic relationships between the corporate and the creative worlds, and empowering our leaders to tap into both their masculine and feminine energies. I believe that we can redefine social and business norms, we can unlock potential, and ultimately create authentically fearless cultures that will change the world effortlessly for the better. So what does balance mean to me? So everything that we do with Roundtable this year is focused on balance. From the Positive for Youth Awards that we run for young people, where we're getting them to explore gender balance globally, to the World Assembly for Women, which is providing opportunities for individuals and globally and organisations to commit to action globally. So I would like to leave you all with a question today. And that is, what do you think a world balanced by masculine and feminine leadership energy would look like? And what would that mean to you? Thank you very much for listening.